I knew I loved the natural sciences, but I liked geology, I liked biology, I thought I wanted to learn about astronomy, and I realized that vertebrate paleontology kind of allowed you to go in many directions.
In the interviews, the women that we selected, their stories are as diverse and multifaceted as any you could imagine. I was looking for a different type of project. I also felt a certain responsibility to document the history of women in our field. And this includes not just researchers, but educators, illustrators, artists, preparators from around the world. I'm Annalisa Berta, Professor Emerita at San Diego State University. I've been a vertebrate paleontologist for 40 years. I proposed a book that I co-wrote with another paleontologist, Susan Turner, and she has a rich background in the history of women in geosciences, so I thought she provided some good information. And together we proposed this book to be published by Johns Hopkins University Press. We thought it was very important that we interview women in the field so that we could, explore their stories and their history. So we selected 18 women to interview. We interviewed them at the annual meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we chose these women based on their diverse research areas, different lengths of time that they'd been in the field, and their different nationalities.
My father, he was a paleontologist. One of the first generation of Mongolian paleontologists trained in Russia. So he was my mentor and not only father. So he really opened the door to the field.
So we wanted to tell these stories in the hopes that they would encourage girls and young women to be excited about science and to hear the passion that these women bring to the field, and hopefully get a few people interested in pursuing the field of vertebrate paleontology.
So as a child, I was always really interested in digging things up and finding things in the garden. And I also had quite a strong interest in both natural history and also in history as well too. And I was really interested in biology as a subject at school, and so I went on to university to study biology. And while studying biology, I was introduced to paleobiology and the study of the biology of dead animals, basically. And so that's what really sparked my interest in vertebrate paleontology.
I always loved the outdoors. I loved camping, I loved hiking, I loved animals. And so when I went to university, at the University of Michigan, I thought I would go into biology. And just honestly, one evening I was hanging out with some people, and we were talking about how much we like camping, and somebody mentioned that there was a class that was 8 weeks of camping out in Wyoming, and it was a geology class. So I signed up for it, and not knowing anything about geology, and one of the instructors was a paleontologist in the Department of Geological Sciences at Michigan. And I realized during the course of that 8 weeks that basically paleontology is everything that I love about biology, but with the added component of time that just made it so much more interesting to me.
I was sort of debating between the fields of conservation and paleo, and I felt as if I had to make a decision. It was sort of an either or. But the really great thing is that the fields have sort of come together where we can now use the fossil record to ask questions of relevance to conservation.
It's not so much my individual discoveries that I feel are my proudest accomplishments, but more the fact that I feel as though I have been learning how to integrate all those different perspectives, and partly to gain a greater understanding of where humans fit in, and also just to realize how connected we are with the rest of nature.
I grew up on a grain farm in southeastern Saskatchewan, and as a child I spent a lot of time on the land, particularly with my grandmother. We would walk the land, we collected rocks, I was always looking for fossils, and in fact I cannot think of a time that I didn't want to be a paleontologist. I think it's exciting to go to places that few people few paleontologists have ever explored before. It's kind of the last frontier in some ways in our science.
Like the most remarkable experience in the field was my excavation of more than 40 fossil whales in the Atacama Desert in Chile, in my country. We stayed in the field for a lot of weeks. We were excavating, discovering so many whales, but also other marine mammals. And for me, that was, wow, was crazy.
I really have my ancestors long ago to thank for my early career boost, because the anthropologists were very interested in taphonomy. They were trying to separate what humans did to bones from what everything else did to bones.
Field work is constantly inspiring, I think, and partly it's not just where fossils come from, but it's also a chance to step out of, usually out of a very busy, often urban, often kind of high-stress life into a life that's really out in nature. And you feel more as if you're having conversations with the past and the present. And it's a time that you can be a little more reflective and integrate a little more, and even let some questions that are kind of quietly gestating, kind of come to the fore. And I feel as though those field seasons have always been incredibly inspirational and restoring.
The last couple of years, I've gotten interested in telling the stories of our history. Especially, I thought this was important for younger generations, so they know some of the challenges that we've met and overcome.
I remember asking Nick if I could go out in the field with him. And he just basically said, well, we can't make that happen. And I've been eternally sad that I didn't challenge him in some way, because he was such a nice guy.
I have a 15-year-old daughter now, and when I was pregnant with her, I remember thinking, I am going to just continue doing everything I normally do. I'm not going to let having a child stop me. And my husband's also in the field, so we work together, we collaborate a lot on projects, and that meant that I was going to have to take my kid to the field with me.
You're the only woman. I mean, I remember when I was just out of grad school and it was me and literally like 15 Chinese guys, and so we had cultural differences. Not necessarily, different communities and cultures are more supportive of women scientists or respect education. You're still the one of two on a field team, or I was. Or as leading my own field expedition, sometimes I've encountered things where I feel like I'm doing, maybe someone turns to someone who's a male member of my team, assuming that they have authority in place of the actual field leader who raised all the money and does all the planning, and but I've also been fortunate in many cases with my collaborators, obviously the ones that I continue to work with, that we've worked out those differences. And I have done international fieldwork since I was a grad student. So it's not a barrier I don't see it as a barrier, I see it as something you have to commit because you're so passionate about doing this thing that you will move beyond things that might arise.
We are vertebrate paleontologists. Our data come from the field ultimately. And you can do a lot, as I do, a lot with museum collections, but going out and finding new fossils around the world is very, very important. And there's huge parts of the world, of course, that have very poor records, especially for the time periods that I'm interested in, the Cretaceous and early Paleogene. And that, I think, is one of those things that sometimes women can feel is a very daunting prospect to participate in, or especially to start and lead fieldwork around the world. And there are lots of barriers to doing that. Certainly other parts of the world will have more sexism or racism than maybe some of the Western liberal democracies that many of us will have had most of our experiences in, at least that I have. But it is really, really worth doing that. One, because we are the face of science, and the more we do that, the more it becomes accepted, and the more we are able to inspire people in those countries, young women in those countries, to rise up and become leaders in science in those fields. And I think that's been really great. I think it's been really great to have supportive men who have gone out in the field with us, or taken me out in the field with them in some cases, to really push that and make sure that field crews are more diverse, because it does have a really big impact on people to see diversity in science. And as a very international field, I think vertebrate paleontology not just in an international field, but one that has really captured the public attention. I think it's really important that we portray that around the world, and really, I think, can have more of an impact in affecting change than a lot of other sciences can.
I realized that I could solve puzzles outdoors. I love being outdoors. And learn a whole new language of reading the rocks. So, and then I had great experiences in field camps. I was the first woman TA in the Indiana University field camp. And that helped to build up my confidence. And then I went to Harvard.
One is the difficulty, I think, of the two-body problem. My husband is not an academic, but he's in science as well too. And when I finished my PhD, we spent quite a lot of time living in different parts of the country and only seeing each other for parts of the week, which is not an uncommon problem in academia. And so that was pretty challenging, actually. But eventually, we managed to get through it. But people have to make compromises sometimes as well too. So that's tricky. I also have 2 children as well too, and I've taken a total of 18 months maternity leave as well too.
I have 3 children. Right now they're aged 18, 11, and 9. And although I wouldn't trade it for the world. I love my kids and it's been wonderful. I would say what does tend to get challenging at times is how people treat me. Sometimes there's this idea that if you have a family, that maybe you don't care as much, or you're not going to be as good at your field, your paleontology field, maybe not as cutting edge or what have you. But I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, I would say that my kids have actually taught me a lot, and I think have made me a better scientist in many respects. One of the things I learned right away when I brought that first baby home was I had to be efficient. I had to learn to use my time properly. I had to prioritize, and that meant that when I went to the office, I had to be doing what I needed to do. I didn't have a whole lot of free time, especially when my children were little. I think it's been important for my graduate students too to see, you can do both. It's quite doable to be both a good scientist and a mom. And I think it's been important to me to have, to bring my kids out. They come, sometimes they'll attend classes at times, but usually it's more field work. Then my graduate students see that and go, oh, well, I can do that. I could do that too.
So I've had a lot of really important mentors at all the different institutions I've been at. My PhD advisor was really helpful in providing me with good professional development and sort of making me feel as if I could sort of do it all. I could have a family and I could be a vertebrate paleontologist, and that was Bruce McFadden. I've also been really inspired by people who haven't been official mentors, so it was really phenomenal to see so many women presidents as I was a graduate student, and to see that was sort of the normal or the new normal for the society. And even just this last year, it's been really inspiring to see so many women on the executive committee and just see that the leadership is really now dominated by women, which is wonderful.
Yeah, when I first started out in college, I went to college in Montana at Montana State University, and one of my mentors there was Jack Horner. And he was really, I was the only undergraduate student that he had at that time. He had a lot of grad students. I think at the time I was there in school, I think he had 19 graduate students.
Wow.
But I was the only undergrad. And that gave me some sort of special opportunities to do field work or to work in the museum on research questions. I started off as a fossil preparator, and Jack was always very open about letting me try new things, even things that sometimes might have flopped. And I think that his mentorship and just sort of trusting me to ask my own questions and to find out whether I could answer them or not with the methods I was trying to use was really inspirational. I also had a lot of really wonderful female mentors during that time of my life because Jack had so many wonderful women graduate students. And so they helped me with all kinds of navigation of the early parts of my career, including things like, you know, what do you do when you're in the field? What are sort of field norms? How is it to be a female member of an all-male field crew? And those women were very important. So people like Mary Schweitzer, Karen Chin, there were so many. Carrie Ansell, who is a preparator at the Museum of the Rockies, was in the field with me a lot during those years. And then I went on to graduate school at Stony Brook University, and I picked that program in part because my advisor was going to be Kathy Forrester. And I thought it was really wonderful the idea of having a female mentor after being in this kind of more male-dominated program was really exciting to me. And it was actually some of those female grad students of Jack's that put me in touch with Kathy and helped me make that connection. And I had a great time at Stony Brook being her student. So
the most important people for me, one of them is Carolina Goodstein. She's a young paleontologist from Brazil, but she's in Chile. And she actually was the first paleontologist I ever met in my life. And she was really, really important for me to to be involved in paleontology and and do research and marine mammals, what I'm doing right now. Another person who has a really important role for me is Dr. Nicholas Payenson. He has been a mentor for me, and he has provided me a lot of opportunities. And I will say the first opportunity he provided me was participate in the excavation of the wells in Atacama Desert. Thanks to that, I could get involved with other paleontologists from different countries.
My advisor was Dr. Don Prothero, and he's the reason I'm a paleontologist. I had no interest in it until we crossed paths. I right away told Don, I want to be a paleontologist, and he was like, wait a little while, you know, and then the next semester I took paleontology, and I couldn't even get through the class before I was like, no, I'm serious about this. I want to do it. And he was very supportive. You know, I've always been interested in my Chinese culture, and there's amazing fossils coming out of China at the time and still today. So I asked him to help me combine these two passions, and he contacted all the paleontologists working in China in the LA area, and I ended up working with Wang Xiaoming for my undergrad research. But yeah, so it was really something I discovered quite late in life.
And so I really feel that Steve Gould has also been one of my mentors as well. And then also Kay Berensmeyer, part of our research team in working in Pakistan. And here was a very, bright, interesting, successful paleontologist who was also striking out in new directions with her work on taphonomy and paleoecology. And that, in a sense, showed me that there's nothing to fear about being a woman in this field. So all of those people, I think, made a big difference.
Brian Patterson took me on as a graduate student. He himself was an iconoclast, a kind of self-made person, and he was very supportive of unusual graduate students. There weren't that many women at the time, and I wanted to do something different. And so he was a very, very big influence on me, as well as just being a tremendous scholar. And then I had lots of other mentors along the way.
I think that we are becoming more and more aware of the issues that women are facing in STEM disciplines, and vertebrate paleontology, unfortunately, is no exception to that. And I guess I would just like to say that I think women like myself at the stage of my career, it's so important for us to be mentors to young women in vertebrate paleontology.
If a student comes to you and says they're interested in vertebrate paleontology, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, I usually get quite excited at that point that I've infused them to be interested in vertebrate paleontology. In terms of advice I would give them, I think there's a number of different things as a student you need to consider is your interest in the subject will take you so far that in this day and age it's so difficult and it's competitive to get into graduate school that they need to really work very hard, and they also need to think really broadly about the subjects that they study. Because paleo, and especially the kind of stuff that I do, is not simply biology and anatomy and looking at fossils. It encompasses so many different subject areas. So physics, maths, chemistry, geology as well too. So I often say to the students, get a broad background and as much breadth as you can really in the subjects that you study. You know, read around, don't just read about the particular group of animals that you're interested in. And so that will be the first advice that I would give them.
A big piece of advice, I think, is to seek out good mentors, which is a hard piece of advice to give because you don't always know who the good mentors are. And so then I would follow it up with just meet as many people as you can, because in that process you will probably run into some people who are good mentors and maybe some who aren't. But if you meet as many as you can, you start to become a known entity. Volunteer to do things in your society. You know, even if you have the time to do it and you have the capacity, don't feel like, oh, because I'm young, I'm not supposed to co-organize a diversity luncheon, for example. That is, you know, if you want to do it, you should be able to do it, and people are always happy to have the help. So I think just putting yourself out there and getting involved as much as you can is probably the best advice.
And I've tried to encourage my students that way too. I want them to, you know, I'm happy if they are part of my research program, also happy if they take off and want to go in another direction. And mainly I just want them to realize that whatever they want to do, I want to be there for them.
You know, ask for advice, seek out your elders in the field, the people who have been doing it longer than you, because they've been there, they've done that, they know what works and what doesn't, but also figure out what works best for you and follow your gut. A lot of times you got to trust yourself. That's one of the things that I've had to learn the hard way, I guess, but it's all worked out in the long run. You do what's best for you, and everything comes along when you have the time to get to it. And the fossils luckily have been there for a long time, and more often than not, they'll wait for you. So, yeah.
I would say it's important to really familiarize yourself with what the field actually is. And a good way to do that is to attend Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meetings, to really learn what the science is. Find yourself a good mentor. I think what's been huge and very influential on my career is having an amazing set of mentors over the years that have not only introduced me to the field, but also introduced me to each other, for that matter, too, meeting different scientists in the field, and you know, gave me good advice along the way when I needed it. I think having a mentor and somebody that you can talk to about the field has been very important. For me, that happened to be a paleobotanist, Beth McIver, when I first was when I was an undergraduate. So I'd also say to students that a good mentor doesn't have to be somebody that is doing exactly what you want to do. Right. You might find a good mentor in another area of paleontology or another area of geology that that really is inspiring and is there to provide some advice along the way.
The one thing I would like to sort of share is, like, in this day when there's so many techniques, both computational, mathematical, things like, you know, scans and everything, and they're great. They're giving us information into things that we couldn't possibly know otherwise. It's still really important to know your organisms and know your data, because these techniques, they can give you results, but they can't give you the questions, and they can't give you the interpretations. And I mean, I would think, you know, yes, it's important to learn R. It's also important to have a good stack of pencils and backs of envelopes to work things out on as well. Know what you expect to find first. Understand the animals and the bones and everything, and then you can use those techniques to their best advantage.
Yeah, instead of the techniques driving the question, really. You have to start with a question first, yeah.
And you have to also know what to expect, more or less. Otherwise, how can you tell if it's all some awful error? Because you can get some very precise results out, but you have to somehow know that that's going in the right direction.
Right. The advice that I would give students that want to go into paleontology today, just based on my own experiences, would be to always take advantage of opportunities, and don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to change or make changes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be even afraid to fail, because you're going to succeed more often than you're going to fail, and you learn from mistakes. But I think the whole course of my career has been just seeing opportunities and taking them. And that would be the advice I would give any student today.
I think being resilient is one of the most important things, being persistent. I think one of the hardest things getting a job as a vertebrate paleontologist. There aren't that many of them, and I think flexibility in that sense, and if you're at, as a graduate student, at a place where you have an opportunity to teach human anatomy and learn human anatomy, that opens up an avenue for postdocs that you can have, or ultimately even positions. So that broadens your opportunities, so that's a good idea if you can do that. But also then one of the hard things is funding. It's difficult to get funding, and so you have to be willing to try and try and try again. And you have to also avoid distractions. So as a woman, even as a graduate student, and then if you have a postdoc or faculty position, women are often called upon to serve on committees and do various outreach activities, which we want to do because we want to serve as role models, but it can be a bit excessive. And for young women especially, I think they have to keep their eyes on the prize and go for focus on their research and do some of those opportunities, but try to keep them to a minimum, always focusing on the goal, because getting a PhD is much harder than you think it is. The writing takes much longer than you think it will, and so it's important to just keep your eye on that prize and keep working towards it.
So I think we women have a bright future in invertebrate paleontology, but I do think that it's up to people like myself and yourself to be mentors.
Even though you are your worst critic frequently, so believe in yourself, despite what you're thinking, believe in yourself.